Today, I wanted to talk about what happens once an offer is sent over. What are the next steps after that? What happens to get the buyer the keys to the house and the seller the check at the end of closing? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to be going over my checklist, so you're going to see me looking down. That's just a practice I do with all my business where no matter how many times I've done it, I have checklists in place to make sure that I don't miss anything. I owe it to my clients to make sure that I'm clicking on 100% satisfaction. So that's always the goal. So let's get right into it. So first of all, where I'm discussing is you have the buyers and the sellers are already in place. We have a house and the offer is sent over. So if you want to know what happens before that, check some of my other videos out. So once an offer from the buyer is sent over to the seller, three things can happen. They can either accept it, do a counter, or flat out reject it. So three things can happen again. They can just, as is, whatever the terms and the conditions and the price that the buyer sent over, the seller can just say, yeah, I'll take it, and we move to the next step. Or they can reject it. And at that point, the buyer has a couple options, whether to do bring together a new offer on their own, or they may have rejected it because they accepted a different offer. Then there's pretty much no recourse on that end, or a counter offer can happen. And that's just that your agents will be going back and forth, whether your agent is the seller's agent or working with the buyer. They're going to do things that's in the best interest of their client and hopefully can get to the next step, which is acceptance. And acceptance triggers to something different. The acceptance is whatever the terms, whether they went through the first offer or a counter offer, whatever those terms are, both parties agree that they accept the terms. And that pretty much unlocks the next important step. The next important step is the inspection. The buyer has an opportunity to, and it's usually negotiated in the offer also, a set amount of time where they have to get any inspections that they want to be done. During that time, the buyer, again, conducts all desired, whether it's for the physical or environmental. Sometimes I'm sure you guys are familiar with if they want to do some mold or radon tests, or I just had a client just do a physical inspection where, again, you're hiring a professional inspector. This is not done by the real estate agent, but a qualified person who does. That's what they do, inspections. And they look at the major things like the roof. They look at the foundation. They look at the electrical systems. They look at the plumbing. And really the goal is to have the buyer informed with inspection so that they know exactly what this as is. I'm in Michigan, we have an as is condition, what the as is condition is. After the inspection is complete, the buyer has an opportunity to reply to the report that they get from the inspection. And the reply pretty much is the buyer deciding what they actually either want done by the seller or what terms they need to change, if any, based on what that inspection comes back. Once the seller accepts or reads what the reply is from the buyer's inspection, they have the opportunity to complete any desired repairs or remediate any issues that came up with the inspection, or on the continuum of doing nothing. They can decide to do nothing, or they can decide to do everything, the buyers. And again, that's when your agents come in and their expertise and their experience at negotiating what works best for each client. And again, one thing that we like to do with Principal Keller Williams is develop a win-win. Once we get into those points where we need to negotiate, it's not about negotiating just to see who can win the argument. We're trying to negotiate to make sure that, depending on whether I'm representing the seller or the buyer, that each party is reaching their ultimate goal. After those negotiations happen, the buyers hopefully and the sellers agree to what's going to happen, what's going to be the remediation of the different repairs that have came from the inspection. So after they agree, let's say the inspection came and both parties agree that they're going to do everything, nothing, or a little bit of it. They agreed on it. The next step is to make sure that there's a clear title. Now, sometimes I know one practice we do with our sellers, we do a preliminary title search to make sure that there aren't any encumbrances, they call, or any liens on the property that would prevent the buyer from getting a clear title, meaning no one else owns it, no one else has any claims to it, and they own the house outright, with the exception of maybe the mortgage that they're putting on it. So their particular bank may have a mortgage on it. After it's satisfactory, after they're satisfied that it's a clear title, the loan goes to underwriting. This is not a cash deal. The loan goes to underwriting where it's funded. And I'm just going to read it. While the buyer and their agent have lead responsibility here, the listing agent also has the responsibility to the seller to assure the buyer's loan is processing with all due haste, meaning that, they're not just, for whatever reason, taking their time and stretching it out. Again, the contracts are always, if they're written right, have deadlines on them. So we want to make sure that we're sticking to the deadline so that the deal doesn't fall out of contract. And that could be a lot of things. We could lose a buyer that way. You could lose earnest money deposit. So it's on us, the agents, to make sure that all the different deadlines are being met. After that, it goes into, we get escrow instructions from the lender, and either or both parties may have given the title and escrow company special instructions about the disbursement of the funds. Both agents have the responsibility to make sure that any questions about the disbursements and the details are answered to avoid, again, any last minute delays. Again, we're working on a time frame. Closing disclosures happen after that. And the closing disclosures is a federally mandated. It's a 5-page form that provides final details about the mortgage loan. It includes loan terms, the projected monthly payment, and the closing costs. Again, this is for full transparency so that the buyer knows exactly the cost that they have to pay. And the lender is required to provide the closing disclosure at least 3 business days before closing. Again, this is 2018. I'm not sure when you're watching it, but this is to ensure that if there are any issues, that the buyer has time to ask questions, and if anything needs to be adjusted, that can be done before closing. In the past, sometimes buyers were getting these documents, on closing date, and to better protect the buyer and both the seller too, but specifically the buyer, they know exactly what they're signing, exactly what their payments, exactly what the not just the monthly payments, but the down payments that they need to be bringing to the table. Once that happens, then we're almost at the finish line. We get to the closing. That's the final face-to-face meeting of both parties to conclude the transaction. Each party signs the required documents with the title and escrow officer present to oversee the signing process. Funds are presented by the buyer and the buyer's lenders to satisfy the terms of the sale, and the seller receives their funds. And after that, that's pretty much when the buyer and seller are pretty much the property is transferred. But the last step is the recording and the possession. The transaction becomes a part of the records of the local government entity with jurisdiction, and that transaction is complete. The buyer takes possession of the property that the seller has vacated unless the seller's carryover or the buyer's pre-occupancy has been a part of the contract. So sometimes, they'll close, and depending on what's going on, the seller may need another 2 weeks for whatever reason, or 3 weeks, but that would be in the contract. But after that, the actual ownership has changed. Hoping that's helpful of what it looks like, the process, where the real estate agent, I call it, really earns their keep, earns their portion of the transaction. To be quite honest, the showing of the housing is the easy part, I like to say, as far as from the real estate agents, because, doesn't really take much skill to do that. But having an experienced agent is important, an agent that have seen all the different hiccups that could happen when it comes to bring a deal from offer to close. We have a saying in our industry that the deal doesn't close till it closes. All of those different steps, something could happen at each step, and it's going to be my job as your agent to make sure that